On the morning of February 19th, 1942, even before the sun could manage to set any warmth on Seattle's damp sidewalks, Kenji Sato noticed that something was different in the weight of the mailbag. It wasn't only the amount, it was the way the messages arrived in his hands. There were fewer sealed envelopes and more postcards, words exposed in tight lines, as if the entire city had been pushed to speak without whispering, obeying the logic of inspection and paper saving that, since December, had been insinuating itself as an unwritten rule. The smell of wet paper mixed with the worn leather of the bag was the same as always, with glue and fibers softened by the constant drizzle. But the contents felt out of place, as if someone had nudged the street a few inches to the side and expected no one to notice. Kenji was not a man of politics nor of speeches. He was a 32-year-old Japanese-American mail carrier, an employee of the United States Post Office, used to measuring life by the numbers on doors and by the steady pace from one corner to the next, with hours marked by ferry whistles at the harbor and the back and forth of streetcars. But that day, on the bulletin board at the station on First Avenue, the news of the newly signed presidential decree was already pinned up with thumbtacks. An executive order allowing military areas to be defined and people to be removed, dated February 19th, and already circulating in typed and printed copies. The paper seemed too dry, too stiff, with ink still fresh and an administrative tone that allowed no reply. There, Kenji understood with a calm that hurt that his work, carrying messages between houses, was about to become something else, carrying traces between absences. He went out on the route that covered Japantown, near Jackson Street and 6th Avenue South, where English signs shared space with Japanese lettering in the windows of groceries, laundries, and small boarding houses, and where the movement of workers and customers mixed with the traffic of light trucks and the squeal of rails. The fine winter rain of Puget Sound left the asphalt dark and the streetcar tracks shining, with puddles reflecting electric wires and facades. In front of Watanabe Dry Goods, Mrs. Watanabe was already sweeping the entrance, repeating the gesture like a clock, pushing toward the gutter the mix of leaves, sand, and soot. Kenji raised his hand. She answered with a brief wave, but her eyes stayed on him a second longer. On many faces there was a contained urgency, as if the whole neighborhood had begun counting down a time no one said out loud. A time measured by notices and rumors, by visits from agents and sudden changes in routine. The first delivery was a postcard addressed to Mr. Hiroshi Tanaka, 414 South Main Street, Seattle. On the back, only a few carefully written lines, and a purple stamp marked censored in English, a mark that used to appear on international mail and now showed up on pieces that seemed domestic, with signs of handling and checking. Kenji held the card a moment longer than he should have, not really reading, only registering the handwriting and the mark. It was not the first time he had seen censorship since Pearl Harbor on December 7th of the previous year, but now it seemed to be spreading like mold, reaching ordinary correspondence between relatives, between friends, and changing even the way people chose words and shortened sentences. At other doors, the pattern repeated. Postcards, short telegrams, envelopes opened and restapled, with different folds and staples that were not the senders. Some residents received government notices, printed on thick paper, with instructions about registration, hours, and what to bring, standardized language and spaces for names and addresses. There were also letters from banks asking for address confirmation, and a piece of correspondence from an insurance company informing of policy cancellation, as if risk had been reclassified by decree. The mail, which had once been a thread between lives, was beginning to sound like a hammer driving nails. Kenji had known those names since before the war. He had grown up in Tacoma, the son of immigrants from Hiroshima, and had earned his job at the post office on merit. Written exam, recommendation, and through a quiet stubbornness, in a federal service that demanded punctuality, record-keeping, and discipline. He wore the blue uniform with contained pride, with the cap and the badge that identified him as part of a public machine. In Seattle, he rented a simple room in a boarding house near Yesler Way and sent part of his wages to his parents, as so many did to support family and pay rent and bills in uncertain times. He didn't frequent clubs or stand out. He liked routine, early black coffee, shoes always shined, knowing the city had order even when it was noisy, and recognizing the shape of streets in his body without needing to look at a sign. But in late February, order seemed to be coming from somewhere else, and the city responded with placards nailed to walls, notices on cheap paper, and large letters. In the following weeks, Western Defense Command posters began to appear on poles and storefronts, especially after General DeWitt announced restrictions on the West Coast, and the presence of forms and instructions became part of the scenery, like rental or job advertisements. On March 27, 1942, when the curfew order for enemy aliens and persons of Japanese ancestry went into effect in areas of Washington state, Kenji had already delivered dozens of notices, unable to control the slight tremor that sometimes rose in his wrist. Some recipients did not open the door. Others opened too quickly, as if they were expecting the knock. Many had reddened eyes from poorly slept nights, and fatigue showed in the way they held the paper, as if it burned. The children, when they appeared, were far too quiet, with an attention that did not belong to their age. In early April, the language of addresses began to change, and Kenji noticed it as if it were an alteration in the city's very map. A letter addressed to Mrs. Nakamura came with the destination crossed out and rewritten: Puyallup Assembly Center, Puyallup, Washington. Another, for a man who worked at the fish market at Pike Place, already said Camp Harmony, care of WRA. There was no street, no number, no city as before. There was center, there was care of, there were initials, and there was the sense that an address stopped being a place and became a category. The geography of the mail was being replaced by a geography of confinement. Kenji, who had always oriented himself by mental maps of blocks, began to feel the ground dissolve under his feet, as if the very logic of delivery had been rewritten by orders external to the counter and the postmark. Faced with what he could not stop, he tried to do what he always did when something new appeared: organize. In the small room of the boarding house, at night, he turned on the lamp and copied into a notebook the names of the places that appeared in the correspondence: Puyallup, Minidoka, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain. He noted postmark dates and the type of paper, observing when there were forwarding marks and when the ink seemed fresher or more worn. It was an attempt to keep a continuous line, as if writing could hold the community in place. The radio in the common room spoke of victories and defeats in the Pacific, of ships, rationing, fundraising drives, and official instructions, and the announcer's metallic voice passed through the thin walls. On the street, some shopkeepers hung American flags in windows as protection, as visible proof of loyalty in a time when symbols were treated like documents. In Japantown, certain storefronts began closing before sunset, even when the law did not yet require it, as if the curfew had already settled in the mind before it settled on the clock. It was on an afternoon of April 7th, 1942, that Kenji saw the word evacuation printed in large letters on a notice posted near 8th Avenue for the first time. The paper fluttered in the cold wind. The notice said that all persons of Japanese ancestry were to report for registration, with specific instructions and veiled threats of punishment for disobedience, and the form of the text resembled other military communiques, direct, with no room for questions. Kenji passed by with the mailbag and felt his stomach tighten, not from immediate personal fear. He was a citizen a federal employee, but from realizing that the entire neighborhood was being pushed off the map. The route he knew was being erased, not by fire or flood, but by paper pasted to a pole. That same week, he delivered a letter to Mr. Ito's barbershop. The door was half open, and the smell of lotion and talc was familiar, mixed with the odor of damp wood and metal. Mr. Ito, a short man with graying hair, sat alone, without customers, with the chair empty and the towel folded, as if waiting for a movement that did not come. Kenji held out the mail, and Ito took it with fingers that seemed older than before. There was a pause, as if both were searching for something to say that would not fit in the narrow space between counter and door. Ito looked at Kenji's uniform, at the post office badge, and then at the paper in his hand. His voice came out low and controlled, avoiding pronouns that involved him directly, as if language too had been subjected to new rules. He said only that some men were selling tools for almost nothing, that the temple on Main Street had received visits from the police, that the neighborhood was full of people writing down license plates, and that the feeling was of inventory, of counting. Kenji nodded. The conversation dissolved into silence. When he left, the rain had increased. Drops struck his cap like small nails, and the fabric of his coat darkened at the shoulders. The moral catalyst did not come in the form of a speech, but in a detail that struck Kenji like a thin blade. At the end of April, he received at the station a bundle of returns, mail that could not be delivered, with undeliverable stamps and forwarding marks that indicated forced relocation, not voluntary moving. Among them was a letter with the name Sato, Mrs. Fumiko, his mother's name, addressed to Tacoma. In the corner, forwarding stamps and a hurried note. Removed. Kenji stood still with the letter in his hand, feeling the room spin around the noise of stamping machines and the telephone, and around the coming and going of co-workers who kept working as if it were just another procedure. His mother had not written to him. Someone had written to her, perhaps a relative, perhaps a bank, and now the letter returned as if their house had ceased to exist. That night, he called Tacoma from the public phone on the corner, cold coins in his palm, hearing the click of the mechanism and the hiss of the line. The line hissed, and when his father's voice came on, it was lower than usual. His father said that officers had come weeks earlier, that there were orders, that the family had been instructed to report to a gathering point. He said they were going to the Puyallup Assembly Center on the fairgrounds, where they had already set up barracks and fences, and where exhibition space and grandstands had been converted into temporary housing. He said neighbors helped store some things, but much was sold in haste for amounts that did not match years of work. He said there was no time. His father's voice spoke as if describing the weather, not as if asking for help. Kenji gripped the receiver so hard his fingers turned white. On the other end, his mother did not speak. Perhaps she was nearby, perhaps not. The call ended with a click that sounded final, like a stamp that closes a file. The next day, Kenji took the return letter back to the station and asked the supervisor to see the forwarding records. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with a thin mustache, looked over his glasses and said those things were outside the post office's control, that orders came from the Army and the newly created War Relocation Authority. He said the job was to deliver what arrived and return what had no destination, following instructions and stamps, and that any questioning should be directed to other authorities. He spoke in the tone of someone who wanted to avoid conversation. Kenji did not press there, but something in him shifted. If the mail was the country's nervous system, it was being used to amputate entire limbs, and he was carrying the messages of the cut with the same hand that had once carried invitations, bills, and birth announcements. In early May, Seattle began to see lines of families with small suitcases and tags hanging from their coats, waiting for buses under escort. Kenji passed a group at King Street Station and recognized faces from his route. Mrs. Watanabe with a bundle tied in cloth, 2 children in small hats, a young man with tense shoulders trying to look grown. The noise of the train and whistles mixed with the contained murmur, and the smell of coal and oil mixed with rain and wet clothing. There were no shouts. There was a hard silence, broken only by short instructions from uniformed men. Kenji stood on the other side of the street, mail in his bag, and felt he should not cross. The distance seemed part of an invisible rule. He kept walking because that was what he did, but the route that day seemed to pass through a place that was no longer the same, as if the city had been cut into zones of permission and suspicion. In the week of May 11th, 1942, the exclusion orders for the Seattle area intensified, and the neighborhood began to empty quickly. Doors were boarded shut. Some storefronts displayed signs in English, closed until further notice. Others had improvised placards offering the sale of furniture, sewing machines, bicycles, and the tone was of forced liquidation, not planned moving. Kenji delivered a letter to a boarding house where single workers lived. The owner, a woman who always complained about tenants paying late, was now sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes, with brown paper and twine at hand. She signed for receipt with a trembling hand and said, without looking at him, that the keys would be handed to a real estate agent the next day. Kenji realized that even her handwriting had changed, as if her hand no longer recognized the paper, and as if the signature were a gesture of farewell. That was when he made a simple, heavy decision to try to follow the route beyond the map the post office recognized. It was not a heroic plan. It was a practical and moral necessity, like returning to a house after a fire to see whether anything was still standing. He wanted to know where the letters were going when addresses became centers without streets. He wanted to see whether there was any way to keep a thread between what was being undone. And he wanted, without saying it to anyone, to see his family in Puyallup, even if only from afar, like someone confirming with his own eyes what paper had already decreed. On Saturday, May 23rd, 1942, on a day when the sky opened a little and the light made the green of the trees seem almost indecently alive, Kenji took an early bus toward Puyallup. He carried in his pocket a small notebook and a pen, and in his chest the feeling that he was doing something forbidden even if there was no written law against a man visiting the fairgrounds. The road passed wet fields, wooden houses, gas stations with red signs, and the trip had the rhythm of an ordinary outing, which made the destination stranger. As he approached the Washington State Fairgrounds, he saw the wire fences and the guards, the grandstands and pavilions, which in other years were full of music, the smell of cotton candy, and livestock, were now surrounded by improvised towers. There were lines at the entrance and signs indicating Camp Harmony, a name that tried to give an appearance of normality to a space of temporary detention. Kenji did not go in. He walked along the side road to a point where he could see, through boards and wire, the low roofs of the barracks and the dirt corridors, with dried mud in some stretches and puddles in others. The wind carried a mixed smell of sawdust, latrines, and simple food, and the sound was of footsteps, buckets, and contained voices, muffled by distance. He saw clothes hanging on lines, as in any backyard, and that hit him with a force no newspaper story had. Life was there, compressed and watched, but still life. A woman shaking out a blanket, a child running and being pulled back, a man carrying a bucket. Kenji searched for familiar faces. After a few minutes, he saw a man with his father's gait, the way he tilted his head when listening to someone, and his chest tightened. His father was thinner, wearing an old coat. He spoke with another man and held a metal bowl, a utensil that seemed to have replaced household plates. Kenji could not call out, could not wave clearly without drawing attention. He stood still, hands in his pockets, and let his eyes do what his voice could not. When his father turned his face for an instant toward the fence, he did not seem to see Kenji, or he saw and chose not to show it. The distance was a concrete rule, made of wire, wood, and surveillance. On the way back to Seattle, Kenji felt that something had been torn out and would not return. It was not only other people's freedom, it was the possibility of feeling whole inside the uniform. He returned to work on Monday with the same punctuality, but now each delivery seemed to carry the weight of an absence. And then came the event that would make everything irreversible, not through drama, but through its administrative, cold nature. On June 2nd, 1942, late in the afternoon, Kenji was called into the supervisor's office. Another man was there, in a dark suit, who introduced himself only by his last name and flashed a badge too quickly to be read calmly. The questions were direct. Why had Kenji requested forwarding records? Why had he been seen near the Puyallup grounds? Whom did he speak with? There was no explicit accusation, but there was a tone that turned curiosity into suspicion and treated movement and kinship as items for investigation. Kenji answered in short sentences, always in the third person when he had to mention someone, as if language were a minefield. He said he was a mail carrier and wanted to understand how to forward correspondence correctly, that he had family in Tacoma and had gone to see whether they were well. The man in the suit wrote something down, expressionless, like someone filling out a form. 2 days later, on June 4th, 1942, an official letter arrived for Kenji inside the station itself, delivered as if it were any other. It informed him that, due to needs of the service and security concerns, he would be removed from urban routes and temporarily transferred to internal sorting work, with no direct contact with the public, while a review was conducted. The paper had the usual impersonal tone, but to Kenji it was a sentence. It was not prison, it was not a headline, but it was the loss of what he had built. The right to walk the city as part of it, to be seen as someone who served everyone. The transfer had no clear end date. His route, Japantown, was already nearly empty, but the punishment was real because it said that not even impeccable service was enough to protect him from the suspicious gaze. He began working in a hot, noisy room with stacks of mail sacks, hands full of paper dust and ink, and the constant clatter of stamps, sorters, and metal drawers. The sorting was mechanical, and yet he noticed patterns. More letters to Minidoka Relocation Center, Hunt, Idaho, with a War Relocation Authority stamp. More envelopes to Tule Lake, Newell, California, and many postcards sent from inside the centers, short phrases to fit the space, as if life had been reduced to a narrow margin. Some were returned due to an incorrect Barak or block number or insufficient identification, and came back with forwarding marks that looked like scars. Kenji saw the names and remembered the faces, and that kept him awake at night. In July 1942, heat came to Seattle in an unusual way, a few clear, dry days that made the city seem like another place. Kenji, now without the daily walking, felt his body restless. Sometimes, after his shift, he took the streetcar to Jackson Street and walked the streets where he had once delivered letters. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. Empty storefronts, locked doors, for rent signs. Some businesses had been taken over by others. Different names on the facades, sometimes still with shadows of the old sign, lighter marks where paint had not reached. He saw a group of white men carrying boxes out of former Japanese grocery, laughing loudly, and he passed without stopping. The feeling was of walking through a photograph someone had scraped with a blade, leaving marks. At the end of August, a postcard arrived for him, addressed to his boarding house room. The sender was his mother, Kenji Sato, and the address read Minidoka Relocation Center, Hunt, Idaho. The card was simple, yellowed paper, printed lines, limited space, and the standardized look of correspondence that knew it would be read by third parties. Her handwriting was small and firm. She wrote of the desert heat, the dust that got into everything, the wind that struck the thin walls of the barracks. She said his father worked at some job inside the camp, that there were lines for food, that water was limited. She did not ask for anything directly. There was one short sentence: "The uniform still fits well." It was a way of saying she knew about his removal, perhaps through relatives' letters, perhaps through rumors that moved through the centers like smoke. The card also bore censorship marks, one passage lightly erased. Kenji held that paper as if it were a piece of fabric from the old home, something that still carried the touch of before. He replied with the care of someone stepping on thin ice. He wrote on a postcard, too, because he knew long letters were suspect and often returned. He spoke of the weather in Seattle, of health, of small things like the taste of coffee and the sound of seagulls at the harbor. He said he would send socks and soap if it was allowed. He wrote nothing about anger or injustice, not for lack of feeling, but because he knew unfamiliar eyes might read it. The morality guiding Kenji at that moment was silent. Keep the bond alive without surrendering private life to control. He dropped the card into the mailbox on the corner and felt the strange irony of trusting the very system that watched him with the task of carrying the only line that still connected the family. Autumn brought the rain back. On October 10th, 1942, during a storm that made the drains overflow on 2nd Avenue, Kenji received news from an old acquaintance. Mr. Ito, the barber, had died in Minidoka of pneumonia, according to a short note that circulated among some Japanese Americans who were still outside the centers. There was no funeral in Seattle, no body to mourn. There was only the dry information and the fact that someone who had always been there, with scissors and razor, now ended his life in a wooden barack in the Idaho desert, where cold and dust were part of daily life. Ito's death was the kind of irreversible that makes no public noise, but changes the texture of the world. Kenji walked to the old barber shop on a rainy afternoon and found the door closed, the window covered in dust. On the glass, someone had pasted a for sale notice. He stood for a few minutes looking at the reflection of his own face, mixed with the dark interior, and then he left. As the months passed, the review of Kenji produced no formal accusation, but also did not return his route to him. He remained in internal work, and his pay continued, but the city seemed to treat him like a displaced piece. Some coworkers avoided long conversation. Others were kind in an excessive way, as if trying to compensate for something they did not name. Kenji continued sending postcards and small packages when permitted, wrapped bars of soap, wool socks, sometimes a little tea. Each shipment required forms, lists, weight limits, and content inspection as part of the process. The simple act of sending an ordinary thing became bureaucracy, with stamps and rules that reminded him nothing was purely private. In 1943, the war news changed tone, but the centers remained. Kenji received more cards from his mother, always with contained description. Light snow in the desert, winter illnesses, improvised classes for children, a small garden trying to grow in hard soil. His father wrote less. On a card in March, there was only one line from him, heavier handwriting: "Health continues, work continues." It was his way of not giving himself to despair, of recording continuity where everything had been interrupted. Kenji kept all the cards in a shoebox under the bed, along with a notebook where he had written down the names of the centers. The box was light, but it seemed to contain an entire city, reduced to stamps, dates, and streetless addresses. In the spring of 1944, when cherry trees bloomed on the University of Washington campus and the air was perfumed for a few days, Kenji was finally assigned to a different route, in a neighborhood farther north, far from Jackson Street. It was a concession, not a restoration. He accepted without protest. He walked streets with larger houses, well-kept gardens, and delivered letters to people who did not look at him twice. The work regained its rhythm, but the sense of belonging had a permanent crack. Sometimes, passing a house where children played, he remembered the children of Japantown with tags on their coats, waiting for buses. The memory came like a cold wind inside the uniform. When the war ended in 1945, headlines spoke of surrender and going home, but for many, home no longer existed in the same way. Kenji's family was released from Minidoka at the end of that year, like so many others, with exit papers and little else, and with the need to prove a destination and means of support outside the center. They did not return to Tacoma immediately. The old house had been rented to another family, and recovering anything would be a battle. They ended up going to Seattle, where Kenji managed to find a small apartment near Rainier Avenue, modest, smelling of old wood and looking out onto a busy street with a noise of buses and trucks. In November 1945, on a gray afternoon, Kenji waited at the train station in a simple coat. When his parents stepped down, carrying 2 worn suitcases, they seemed smaller. His mother's face was thinner, but her eyes still steady. His father walked with a new caution, as if his body had learned to conserve energy. There was no big scene. There was a contained embrace, a long touch on the sleeve of Kenji's uniform, and then the practical movement of taking the suitcases and going. Life afterward offered no quick repair. His father found temporary work in a warehouse. His mother sewed for neighbors, mending hems and buttons, and sometimes stood still watching the rain through the window. Kenji stayed at the post office, now back on more ordinary routes, but he never again received the same area he had once called his. Japantown did not return as before. Some came back and opened small businesses, others scattered, many never returned. Mr. Ito's barbershop never reopened. In 1946, Kenji passed the old door and saw that something else operated there, some office, and the street went on as if nothing had happened, traffic and hurry covering the emptiness. At the beginning of 1947, on a cold, clear day, Kenji took his parents to see Jackson Street. They walked slowly, like visitors to a place they had once known from the inside. Mrs. Watanabe was no longer in the shop. The facade had another name, fresh paint. Some Japanese signs still survived, faded like shadows that persisted, and there were nail marks where posters had been fixed. Kenji stopped in front of a pole where he remembered seeing the evacuation notice years earlier. The paper no longer existed, of course, but the memory was as sharp as the rust on the metal. His father looked at the street in silence. His mother adjusted the scarf at her neck and let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. They did not speak of guilt or justice. They spoke of practical things, where to buy cheap fish which bus to take to work, how to keep dampness out of the apartment, as if survival required the language of routine. That night, Kenji opened a shoebox and spread the postcards on the table. Minidoka, Puyallup, Censorship, stamped states. The paper had yellowed, but it still carried the touch of the hands that had written from the other side of fences. He lined the cards up as if they were streets, trying to rebuild a map that existed in no atlas. It was not nostalgia. It was a domestic archive, proof that ordinary people had been moved like objects, and even so had written about wind, dust, soap, health, coffee. He put everything back carefully, closed the lid, and placed the box in the closet, not as someone hiding it, but as someone preserving it. In the years that followed, Kenji kept walking, delivering mail in neighborhoods that changed slowly. The uniform aged and was replaced, shoes were changed, hands grew rougher, and the work continued with its usual regularity, now crossed by memories that did not fade. His mother began to smile a little more as she cared for a small pot of plants in the window. His father sometimes sat in silence with the newspaper open without reading. The city went on, with new buildings, new signs, new wars spoken of on the radio. But for that family, and for Kenji in particular, the mail never returned to being only paper. Each address written with street and number felt like a small victory against erasure. Each postcard recalled that there had been a time when words had to travel exposed, watched, reduced to the minimum. On a spring afternoon, many years later, Kenji passed a blue mailbox shining in the sun, heard the metallic sound of a letter dropping inside, and thought, without stopping, about the way an entire community had been transformed into care of and center, as if language could accommodate confinement and make it seem normal. He did not stop on the sidewalk, did not make a ceremony. He simply kept going, step by step, with the same discipline that sustained him when streets lost familiar names. At home, the shoebox remained in the closet, closed and intact, keeping the stamps and dates the way one keeps seeds, and life continued with the quiet steadiness of someone who learned that maps can be torn, but memories, when well cared for, still have an address. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps ensure that these quiet, often forgotten stories continue to be shared. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We also invite you to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our viewers come from many places and generations, connected by a shared respect for history and the lives that lived it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.